I'm going to be talking about article reviewing. How many of you, I think I gave this presentation in April. How many of you already saw this presentation? Any of you? No? None? Amazing. All right, great. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do today is give you a practical approach to reviewing articles. Let me see if I can do something silly first. How many of you have actually reviewed articles already? 1, 2, 3. There's more, 4, 5. Okay, so you'll, Yoshka, you also did? Yes? Okay, so that's good, because if you've had some experience, maybe you'll appreciate this a little better, I hope. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is give you a practical approach from the perspective of somebody who's reviewed a ton of articles and now editing a ton of articles. So hopefully this will help. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the goals of the review process and what to think about when you're reviewing. Then how to judge specific components of the paper. Then I'm going to give you a very brief suggestion for how to review papers if you have, let's say, the review was due 3 days ago and the editor is hassling you and you have a grant application and a manuscript to write the same day and you want to do it as fast as you possibly can. I will give you a suggestion for an express approach to reviewing, and then finally take any questions. This is very informal, so if you have questions along the way, don't be shy to unmute yourselves. I think the formal presentation is actually not that long, so don't hesitate. Okay, so the first point is, what are the goals of the review process and what should you think about? So the goals of the review process are first and foremost to judge a paper's suitability for a given journal and to provide the editor with clear and prompt feedback. So promptness is important. You know, obviously, usually you get a certain time limit for reviewing. Editors love it if you finish early, and if you can, it's great, but always try to finish within time. It becomes increasingly annoying when the process drags on. For my journal, I usually uninvite reviewers that are late if I have enough reviews to make a decision. And I really don't like it and remain with a negative opinion of people who don't send in their reviews. Now, I think one of the causes of late reviews, besides being busy, it's that people are nervous and they're not sure and so on. Better to send it in on time. Chances are, like most decisions in life, that like most decisions in life, chances are that delaying it is not going to help anyways, and it's best to make sure you do it on time. And always remember that the editor doesn't rely on one single review. For my journal, I try to get 3 reviews for every paper as much as possible, and I know a lot of other journals do. Okay. It's also useful to help the author by providing clear explanations of the basis for your recommendations. That's very important. If nothing else, you need at least one sentence for the authors to explain to them your decision. If you think it's a great paper but needs some improvement, say that. If you think it's a lousy paper, hopefully you have some reasons for why you think that, and you can summarize them in a couple of sentences. It's very important for the author. There's nothing more frustrating, and I see this very, very often, than a reviewer who's uncomfortable with saying something negative to the author and writes to the editor, you know, this is a lousy paper, it should be rejected immediately, and writes to the author, thank you for your very interesting and informative study. I have a few points that I think you should pay attention to. That's bad, because if the editor is stuck with reviews that don't make it clear to the author why the reviewers are recommending what they do becomes really hard. And I've been stuck with that before, with reviews that sound positive but are really quite negative. And then I, as an editor, am forced to write an explanation for why the paper shouldn't get the decision that seems obvious from the reviews. Sometimes I even make myself a reviewer. I've done that a few times, and provide a review for when my decision is going to be different from what the reviewers seem to recommend in their comments to the author. The other thing is providing feasible suggestions to improve the paper. That's extremely useful for the author. And sometimes we kind of put ourselves in the position as a judge instead of as a colleague. And really, we should be trying to think of ourselves as a colleague to the authors. So if their paper is not suitable for this journal, whether it's because it's not the right journal or it's not novel enough or whatever, that's fine. You shouldn't be shy to say it. But then you should, in the comments that you provide to the author, you should make it clear to them what they need to do to make the paper better. And, if it's just, if it's not novel, well, you should say that, but there's a place for less novel papers. If there are fatal flaws, you should say that and say what they are, because you're really helping the author by being clear. You don't help the author by being nice, in quotation marks. Your job is not to provide detailed grammar and spelling corrections. So when I did my first reviews, I was probably like you, very young and enthusiastic and very honored to have the opportunity. And they were like 5 pages long. And I did, basically provided the information I would as a co-author rather than as a reviewer. You don't have to do that, and you probably shouldn't waste your time doing it. So, of course, the authors would love to get, very detailed spelling and grammar corrections, but you don't need to take up your time doing it. However, if you do criticize the grammar and spelling, let's say you feel that it's really badly written, you should give at least a couple of examples of, flagrant errors in grammar or spelling, so that the author can begin to understand what's wrong. It doesn't take much time. By the way, copy pasting from the PDF is very useful. I mean, I assume everybody does it all the time, but instead of saying, page 4, the sentence that starts with blah, blah, the way I used to in the beginning when we didn't get PDFs, it wasn't electronic. Now it's much easier. You just copy paste the beginning and end, let's say, of a sentence you want to critique or something. Okay. Now, after we've discussed kind of the main goals of your review, I have provided on this slide some of the key questions about what you should be thinking about in terms of the decision. So one of the main things you have to, I would say there are 2 parts to the review process. One is arriving at a decision, accept, reject with possibility to resubmit, major revision, minor revision. Do you think this is a good paper? Do you think it's a high priority paper, et cetera? That's one part. The other part is providing explanation so the author knows what you're talking about, and through that helping them to improve their paper. So in terms of the decision, the questions you need to think about are, does this paper address a specific question or not? Every good paper should be addressing at least one specific question. As you'll see later on, that should be stated explicitly. Some papers don't address any questions at all. They're, just if they describe their goal, it's to describe something, and and that's not really a question, and that's a significant weakness. You really need to orient your paper, or the authors need to orient their paper around answering a scientific question. The second important point is, did the paper provide an answer to the question? If it had a clear, first of all, if it has no clear question, that's obviously bad. If it has one or more clear questions, you need to know, do the methods and results, are those adequate to answer the question? And then finally, does anybody care? I mean, you could obviously do a study very carefully comparing the height of people in, I don't know, South China with the height of people in Norway, and conclude that Norwegians are generally taller than Chinese, you know, with a very high level of probability, but, you know, hey guys, we know about this. So there's some questions in medicine that are like that, you know, people try to answer the obvious. And so it might address a specific question, it might provide an answer, but maybe nobody cares about the question. Okay. So what to look for specifically? So these are specific points that are mainly addressed by different parts of the paper. So the first point is, what question did this paper address? Is it clear? Is the rationale clear? And that's really the goal of the introduction. Did the paper provide an answer to the question? That's in the methods and the results. And then, is this the first time this question has been addressed or answered? That should be in the discussion. And finally, does anybody care about the question or answer? And that's also in the discussion. So some journal-specific considerations. Is the paper appropriate for this journal? It might be a great paper, but put into the wrong journal. You know, if I write a paper about the detailed methods for single-cell RNA-seq, and then send it to a purely clinical journal, the readers, you know, may not be interested and may not be helpful for them, even if it has a high impact factor. So you need to know what kind of a journal a paper is appropriate for. Does it deal with a topic that'll be of interest to enough of the readership? That's kind of a related question. Of course, an estimate of the importance of the contribution in relationship, obviously, to the journal and the kinds of articles the journal publishes in general. So if you're reviewing a paper for circulation, you'll be expecting something really novel and important. If you're reviewing it for cardiovascular research, you'll be expecting something novel and important, but maybe not quite to the same level as circulation. If you're reviewing it for some more local journal, then maybe the solidity of the science is more important than the novelty. So the journal is important in the criteria. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to judge specific components of the paper. And some of this is a little repetitive of what I already said, but I think that's perhaps good because I went through some of these points quickly. So these are different aspects of the paper, and they're things to think about. A lot of reviewers don't bother with these. As an editor, I do all the time, and it's a pain in the rear end to me to have to feed back to the authors on it. But these are important considerations, and by the way, they're important considerations for your own papers. So the title should clearly inform readers about what the paper adds to the literature. Okay, so by looking at the title, the reader should already have an idea about what's new and interesting about this. And it should attract readers to the paper and avoid a purely parochial focus. I say that because many journals now, especially now, are international, even if they're, for example, I edit the Canadian Journal of Cardiology, so that's a Canadian journal, but 80% of our readership is outside Canada, and 80% of our paper submissions are from outside Canada. So in general, I don't like papers that come in with a title, Congestive Heart Failure Clinics and Quality of Care in Calgary, Alberta. Because right away, that tells me, and it's going to tell the reader, if I'm not in Calgary, Alberta, I don't give a damn about this paper. So, yeah, okay. So I guess you got the idea about a purely parochial focus. So when you pick the title, it should be something that's generalizable. Salut, Laure.
Salut.
Okay.
Il y a des problèmes? Oui, j'ai été coupé, puis après, j'ai pas pu partager l'écran temporairement. Et là, c'est revenu.
Ok. Bon, je reste connectée pour si jamais il y a des soucis.
Right, excellent. So the second question, of course, is does the title describe the contents well? I mean, that's sort of obvious, but many times they don't. So if you see that the title either doesn't reflect the work well or is sort of non-informative about what's important about the paper, you should advise the authors to improve their title. The title and the abstract are probably the two most important parts of a paper to which people pay very little attention, unfortunately. So the abstract should provide readers with a clear summary of all essential components of the paper. It should make clear the rationale for the work, describe succinctly any major methods, should summarize key results, should conclude with a statement of the essential findings of the paper and why they're important. It shouldn't be an afterthought. And this is really, really important. I think at this point, I'm advising authors in about at least 40% of the papers that are not rejected from my journal how to rewrite their abstract. Because most authors, you know, if you're at all like me when you're an author, you write the paper, you put tremendous energy into writing the paper, and then, oh no, I need an abstract. You just slap it together in 2 minutes of, you know, like, what's the least amount of work can I do for this? The truth is, when people just think about how you look at PubMed, when you look at PubMed, you want to look something up, the first thing you see is the abstract. If that looks like it's important and interesting, you might cite the paper even without reading it, or you'll download the whole paper and go through it. If the abstract looks like garbage, you're not going to bother. If it looks unstimulating or it's unrevealing. So it's really important. And I have now, I mean, this is, I guess, more relevant for authors, but I think it's also relevant for reviewers. I have a very boring, standardized way of doing the abstract, which I think is very useful, which is you need 1 or 2 sentences that provide the rationale for what you did. Whether it's a review article, an original article, a case report, or whatever, there's a reason why you did it, and you should explain it in the beginning of the abstract. Then you should, in general, always put in some way or other the purpose of your paper. You know, this paper was designed to blah, 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 because then right away, the reader knows what the paper is about. Then a summary of the most important key methods, I guess, if relevant, and the most important findings, and then a conclusion sentence or 2 sentences, which tells the reader what the main point of what you found is, or why it's important, or what the key takeaway messages are, something like that, what you're leaving the reader with. And that is, as a reviewer, if you want to provide useful feedback to the author, that's something that you can definitely critique. Okay, the background should summarize the literature that puts into context the goals of the study. That's got to be there. And it should clearly state the goals of the paper. And I almost routinely will tell authors, if they don't do it, say the goal of the paper somewhere in your background, ideally at the end. You know, sometimes people end with a summary of the findings. I think it's all right. That's a stylistic decision. But before you summarize the findings, you have to summarize what you were looking for. And it really helps to have a clear statement of the goals in the background. Importantly, it need not, and it probably should not be an attempt to fully review the background literature. If you see an introduction that's 4 pages long, I would generally advise the author that that's unnecessary, and that a lot of that needs to go in the discussion, because the reader gets lost in a very long background. In fact, often they'll just get bored and say, to hell with it, I'll read something else. In the background, you really need to say clearly why you did this and what you did, what your goal was. Okay, the methods should provide a succinct description of the methods used. In principle, a reader should be able to repeat this study based on the method's description. Obviously, a key issue in research is reproducibility. So although we generally get little mileage out of a study that simply reproduces a prior finding. So that's to say two thoughts. First, that people should be able to reproduce your work by virtue of the methods you provide. A lot of journals will allow you to provide a more detailed methods section online. So you'll often see papers that have little or no methods in the main paper and refer you to a supplement. I generally don't like that, and I advise people to at least put a summary of the main methods in the main paper, and the details can go into an online supplement. But it all needs to be there and accessible. So this is what I just said. Okay, results. So the results should provide in clear form all the results that are needed to understand what the study found, including results of necessary controls, population properties, key outcomes, etc. So when you look at the results section, if there's anything missing, if there are any critical facts that are omitted, data that's omitted, you should tell the authors. Display items are key to transmitting the findings for original studies or concepts and the literature for review papers. And again, the three most important parts of the paper are the ones that people often put relatively little energy into: the title, the abstract, and the display items. And in fact, as you'll see later, those are the things that I often look at the first when I'm reviewing a paper. When you review a paper, you don't have to feel slavishly obliged to go through the paper in the order in which the author wrote it. You can often get a lot of information by just looking at the title, the abstract, and the results. Graphs should be clearly labeled and identified. This is a common problem. If you look at figures, you should be able to know what the author did by looking at the figure, to know what the results were by looking at the figure. And if not, you need to give them feedback as to how to fix it. Material that needs to be available but does not need to be in the main paper can go into an online supplement. That's just something to remember. Okay, discussion. So the discussion should put the findings of the study into the context of the literature. That's a major aspect of this study. And it should also state clearly what the novel aspects of the study are and support that based on prior studies that have addressed related questions. So when you read the discussion of a paper, you can't figure out what's new in this work, then there's a big problem. Sometimes you can figure it out yourself, but the author doesn't say it very well or very clearly. So you need to advise them something like, I appreciate that this paper is important because it shows for the first time, blah, 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 but the author needs to say that so that the reader will know it. On the other hand, if you yourself can't figure out what's important, then that's a major drawback of the paper. And it's probably not because you're stupid, but because the author doesn't say it. So you need to tell them to say it. It should show why the results are important and relevant to cardiovascular medicine. So beyond simply the importance in the immediate field, there's also an issue of the importance in general, particularly related to the journal that you're looking at. Oh, okay. So my daughter and son-in-law and granddaughter who just came in from New York yesterday. So anyway, you know, a paper could be important, for example, in a very narrow field, but if you're submitting it to a general cardiology journal, like for example, Circulation, or even something like CJC or European Heart Journal, it's not enough to show why it's narrowly important in its specific field. You need to also point out what the broader perspective is that'll be relevant to the readership of the journal. That, by the way, is also important, even if it's a specialized journal, because even specialized journals will judge articles based on their broader importance. And if you can highlight the importance, that's useful. And it's important for you to think about and for authors to think about. And of course, finally, it should state any major limitations the reader should consider, as well as highlighting any major conceptual issues. Now, I particularly like using subheadings in the discussion. There are lots of papers that don't use subheadings, but I find that most papers that don't use subheadings, the discussion is not so well organized and it's hard to follow what the author is saying. If you find that that's the case, you should advise them to use subheadings, and they can organize their thoughts under subheadings relating to these issues. So, for example, they could have a section on novel aspects of the study, importance and relevance to the field, limitations, potential limitations, where you could put both technical limitations and any conceptual issues. They can have a section saying previous studies in this area or something like that. So if you have 4 or 5 subheadings of those types, it makes it much clearer. And if it's not clear to you when you read the discussion where all these things are, you could simply advise the authors that organizing their thoughts according to subheadings would be useful. So conclusions are not a required part of the paper, but all papers should end with some concluding paragraph with 1 or more key takeaway messages. Again, it's useful to organize that with a subheading called conclusions, but they don't have to, but they need to provide takeaway messages to their study. As I mentioned, it can have a formal conclusions heading, but it doesn't have to. But importantly, it shouldn't be a repetition or summary of the results. Sometimes people will provide a conclusion section that basically just rehashes the results, and that's not useful to the reader. What you want in a conclusion section is something that will summarize what's important and more of the overall perspective of the paper in the context of the literature. And if a paper doesn't have that, you can direct the authors to do it. And in that, it should state any essential findings or ideas and why they're important. And by definition, if they're essential or critical findings or ideas, there shouldn't be 50 of them. There should be only a limited number. Okay, now, so this is sort of the overall outline of how to approach reviewing papers. Now I'm going to talk about the express approach, which is what I use sometimes when I'm really short for time. So look at the paper the way most readers will. First of all, read the title and the abstract. Do they convince you that the paper might be adding something useful to the literature? If not, that's a detraction on the quality of the paper and at least the composition of the title and the abstract. Then look at the display items. Do the data presented suggest that the findings are novel and solid? So if yes, then you should go back and go through all the steps that I mentioned. But if no, then look quickly at the results and discussion and see if there's anything that changes your impression. So if you look at the results and the discussion and you realize they really have important results that aren't represented in the display items, then you need to read the paper in more detail and tell them that they need better display items. But if you go through and you see, well, what they show in the displays is really what the paper shows, then maybe it's not acceptable right away. And again, similarly with the discussion. So the issue, which of these you look at in more detail depends on what your concerns are. If they're about the importance, you would look more at the discussion. If they're about the solidity of the findings, you would look more at the results. If all of these things, the answer to all of these things are no, then you can write a brief but informative and clear review stating why, in your opinion, this paper should be rejected. So for example, if you look at the title and the abstract, and this seems to be something that's been done 50 times already in the literature, which happens, and you look at the results at the display items, and that reinforces your conclusion, and you look quickly at the results and it looks like there's nothing more in there, then you can probably review that paper in about 20 minutes, and just provide a clear review saying, although the work seems well performed, this question has been asked and answered already many times in the literature, and I don't think it's appropriate for this journal. And then maybe you could put a few more brief comments, but you don't need to spend hours doing the review. So this, of course, will accelerate the review process, but in general, it's only for experienced reviewers. Probably not a good idea in your first 2 or 3 reviews when you don't have much experience. But once you feel comfortable, if you can clearly identify that the paper is not novel and/or not solid, and you don't need to spend a ton of time on it. Okay, so that's the end of the formal presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
I just wondered, because we also had another talk on like how to write a paper and how to write a review, and there was a section about like limitations and how to present the limitations. And would you present that right in the end before the conclusion? Because the other speaker was saying he would like keep the limitations as short as possible, and like not use phrases like this needs to be confirmed in further research, like in the end, which is
well, okay. So first of all, it's okay to keep the limitations. So strategically, let me just put this on my lower screen, which is where my camera is. So I'll be looking at you instead of into the sky. Strategically, of course, if you're talking about writing your own paper, there's an art to writing the limitations section.
Mm-hmm.
So the first part of that is you don't want to destroy your paper by overemphasizing the limitations. On the other hand, there are some very clear limitations that any reviewer in the field is going to know. So you need to recognize them. It's good if you can mitigate them if possible. So, for example, we just had a paper that got a very positive review from my journal. That was a study, it was an outcome study, a clinical study, based on a database that was set up in 2003 to 2006 or 7 that involved only men from Australia. So I urged the author to indicate, so he had a sentence saying, this paper was performed only in men, and further work needs to confirm if it applies in women as well, or something like that. But I urged him to include a sentence saying the study was based on a database composed at a time when there was less sensitivity to the need for equal representation. That's important for the author because some people are extremely sensitive about that point. And I even have editors, people on the editorial board of my journal who've written me emails saying we should reject outright any paper that doesn't include women. So I think that that's an extreme position, but you have to know what you're dealing with. And so there could be other forms of, limitations. Let's say you did a study that involved, electrophysiological measurements, and you did multi-electrode mapping and not optical mapping, but you wanted to do it in an in vivo preparation. So there you would acknowledge that extracellular electrodes don't provide the same detailed information that you can get from optical mapping of transmembrane potential. But since in this case it was critical to get an in vivo assessment, you haven't used it. And it might be interesting for others to assess specific aspects of the study using this technique, or even that you might do it in the future. The limitations are there. Every paper has limitations. And I think what a good reviewer will look at is whether the limitations are a fatal flaw or whether they're understandable and acceptable. And if the reviewer is prejudiced against your paper, which happens, then they're going to find some way to screw you no matter what. So by acknowledging a clear limitation, you're not going to, they might hang the hat on it to go to rant and rave, but that's not the reason really that they're giving you a hard time. So as far as the length of the limitation section, I think it varies depending on how obvious the limitations are, how important you think your science is, and how generally it should be pages long, but it can vary from a succinct paragraph to a few paragraphs, and there's no problem. Very often, if your paper eventually gets accepted, you'll see the limitation section growing and growing as reviewers tell you to do things that you can't do, and they recognize that they're difficult to do. So you just, one approach is to just add. You should always, if somebody criticizes you for something and you recognize that it's something reasonable, but you can't do it and you don't think you have to do it, one way of handling it is to put in a brief sentence or paragraph in your limitations section, recognizing that this is a limitation, and maybe explaining why it wasn't possible or something like that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
No, it's super clear. Thank you so much.